Hello class, how are you guys doing? We're going to talk about supporting your ideas. In our last unit, we talked about how to go out and gather the research that we're going to need for our speech. In this particular chapter, we're going to talk about how to support your speeches with good data and facts and information. Good speeches are not comprised of hot air and generalizations. And how many of you have a few friends or family members who give you just their opinions on things, but they don't necessarily back it up with facts, with data, with opinions? Good speeches are not composed of these hot air and generalizations. They need strong supporting materials to bolster the speaker's point of view. The problem with generalizations that we have is that they don't answer three questions that listeners are always asking of a speaker. What do you mean? Where did you get that from? Why should I believe you? So what? Consider if I said to you, gender equality is yet to be achieved. Interesting. Would you ask me, how do you know that? Where did you get that from? Less general would be, despite progress on some fronts, women lag behind men in positions of political, economic, and academic leadership. You might think that's a little bit more specific, but a good critical thinker is going to say, okay, where's the data? Where's the information? How do you know this? What if I said, according to Sheryl Sandberg, CEO of Facebook and author of Lean In, of 190 heads of state worldwide, only 9 are women. Women hold 13% of legislative seats around the world. In the United States, 15% of top corporate jobs are held by women, and only 24% of full professors are women as well. Which statement do you find the most interesting, the most convincing? Chances are that you prefer the last one, the one with the most support. The skillful use of supporting materials makes the difference between a poor speech and a good one. So for this chapter, we're going to look at the important uses of supporting materials in both informative and persuasive speeches. We'll focus on examples, statistics, and testimony, and how to use them to make your speech great. There are 3 main types of supporting materials: examples, statistics, and testimony. Let's talk about each one of these separately and how you can use them in your speech. An example is known as a specific case used to illustrate an idea. Research has shown that vivid, concrete examples have a strong impact on listeners' beliefs and actions. Without examples, ideas seem vague, impersonal, and lifeless. With examples, ideas become specific, personal, and lively. Have you ever had a professor who was lecturing and you said, hey, I really wish they would give me an example so I can understand this? Most of us like to have examples to clarify. There are different types of examples that we can use in our speeches: brief examples, extended examples, and hypothetical examples. Let's talk about each of them. A brief example is also called a specific instance. It might be referred to in passing to illustrate a point. You can use brief examples piled on top of each other in order to create the desired impression that you need. So if I was going to be talking about energy drinks, I might say, for example, Monster, Rockstar, and Red Bull are all types of energy drinks. That is the way that you might want to use a brief example. Extended examples are often called narratives, illustrations, or anecdotes. By telling a story vividly and dramatically, they pull listeners into a speech. They make them care about what you have to say, and they are something that most of your listeners can relate to. So there's nothing better than a good story, example, or narrative that makes us feel like we can be there as well. Hypothetical examples are incidents that could potentially happen but may not actually have happened. So you could use a hypothetical example to say something like, imagine that you're taking your psychology exam when you notice the student next to you staring at your answers. It maybe didn't actually happen, but it is something that could happen. The hypothetical example creates a realistic scenario, relates it directly to the listeners, and then gets them involved in the speech. It's usually a good idea to follow up hypothetical examples with statistics or testimony that show that it is something that actually could happen. Things you want to keep in mind when you're using examples. Use examples to clarify your ideas. Take, for example, if I am coming into class one day and I say, hey guys, we're going to talk about suspension bridges. Do you think you'd be very excited about that notion? Suspension bridges? Whoa, what even is that? What if I say, there is a famous suspension bridge, and then I show you a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. Most people are now able to visualize what I'm talking about. Or the Brooklyn Bridge, another example. So it clarifies, it brings to focus. You can use examples to reinforce your ideas. Citing an example where this particular statistic that you're talking about has happened before. So essentially, one student is talking about how research shows that more than 30 million adults in the United States lack basic literary skills. To reinforce her ideas, she cited as an example of Dwayne McNamara, a father of 2 daughters who'd struggle with reading and writing before turning to literacy. So it takes that stat and it personalizes it and reinforces it. Most people are interested in people. A social psychologist, Elliot Aronson, explains, most people are more deeply influenced by one clear, vivid personal example than by an abundance of statistical data. So use the stats, which we'll talk about in a bit, but personalize your ideas. Try using examples with human interest in your speeches. You'll discover why many seasoned speakers call them the very life of the speech. All examples should be made vivid and richly textured. The details that make you feel like you are there. And an extended example is just like a story or a narrative. The impact depends as much on your delivery as your content. Many students have discovered this the hard way. After spending a lot of time and energy developing a great example, they might fall flat by not practicing it. And if you've ever had one of these friends that we all do, who doesn't really seem to get to the point, and you're wondering why, what are you saying by this? That is an example of how an example could fall flat. Now let's talk about statistics. We live in an age of statistics. Day in and day out, we're bombarded with numbers, polls, and the average of Americans who eat 350 million pounds of peanut butter, or there were $60 billion in damages. Numbers, numbers, numbers. Most of us would be hard-pressed to say what all these numbers mean. A lot of times statistics, though, can help to prove your point and what it is that you're trying to say. Like brief examples, statistics are often cited in passing to clarify or strengthen your points. Statistics can be used in combination to show the magnitude or seriousness of an issue. It is also a component of a well-supported argument and makes clear the point of your argument. It's also important to understand that using correct statistical measures is a part of being a good speaker. So make sure you know the difference between the mean, the median, and the mode, and use them correctly. So the mean is the average value of a group of numbers. You add them all up, you divide by how many. The median is the middle figure in a group once figures are ordered from highest to lowest. So if you have 1 through 10, it would be 5 in the middle. And the mode is the number that occurs the most frequently in a group. By giving the proper statistics, it helps your audience to be clear about what it is that you're saying. Things you want to keep in mind about statistics. They should be used to quantify ideas. It is important to give Your idea's numerical precision. This can be especially important when you're trying to show that there's a serious problem that is growing over time. Examples can then bring the problem alive and dramatize it in personal terms, but listeners might still want to know how many people this affects. And in this situation, you turn to statistics. Research has shown that the impact of examples is enhanced when they're combined with statistics to show that those examples are typical examples. So we want to know how many, how much. Use statistics sparingly. Why? Because they're boring. As helpful as statistics can be, nothing puts an audience to sleep faster than number after number after number after number. You want to insert statistics only when they're needed and make sure they're easy to grasp. Identify your sources. Figures are easy to manipulate. And this is why careful listeners are keeping an ear out for where you get that from. Where did that come from? Where'd you get that research? Where did that data come from? We want to know that your figures come from reliable sources. Explain your statistics. Statistics do not speak for themselves. They need to be interpreted. They need to be related. Don't just throw numbers at us and expect them to stick and for us to interpret them the way you want them to mean. Explaining what statistics mean is particularly important when you deal with large numbers because they're hard to visualize. You might want to compare them to something else more meaningful. Round off complicated statistics. If I say to you, the population of Switzerland is 8,061,516 people. At what point did I lose you? They might be intriguing, but they're too complicated to be readily understood. So how about the population of Switzerland is more than 8 million? Easier to swallow. Use visual aids to clarify statistical trends. They can save you a lot of time and they can make your stats way easier to comprehend. Imagine you want to show that something is going up over time, accompanied by a good graph that helps your audience to visualize it, especially if they are visual learners like me. Who do you go to if you want to find out who you should take that psychology class with next semester? Most of you probably would say ratemyprofessor.com. Where do you turn on Amazon when you need to figure out if someone else has bought this before and if they like the product? You're probably going to go look at the reviews. If you need a car fixed, you're going to go to a mechanic. If you need legal advice, you're going to go to a lawyer. And if you need help with your speech, you're probably going to come to me. Thus, we rely on testimonies from other people for recommendations, and we usually go to people who have something to do with it or have experience with the issue at hand. You can use expert testimony. In most speeches, you'll probably rely on expert testimony. This is testimony from recognized experts or authorities in their field. Citing the views of people who are experts is a good way to lend credibility to your speech. You import it into your speech and you use it to stand upon. Expert testimony is especially important when your topic is controversial or you feel like your audience might be skeptical about your speech. Another type of testimony that most people don't realize exists is testimony from ordinary people with firsthand experience or insight. So for example, if I'm doing my speech about hurricanes, I might use expert testimony from meteorologists to talk about the parts of a hurricane or the categories of a hurricane. But if I want to explain what it's like to have genuinely lived through one, I might talk to Hurricane Katrina survivor so-and-so. So where you use expert versus peer testimony will vary in your speech, but both can be impactful. You can present testimony as a direct quote or a paraphrase. Testimony can be presented in either way. If you want to quote someone, there are some things that you want to keep in mind for a quote. The standard rule is that quotations are most effective when they're brief, when they convey your meaning better than you can, and when they're particularly eloquent, witty, or compelling. If you find a quotation that fits that criteria, then go ahead and cite it word for word. With direct quotes, we usually say, and I quote, blah, 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 end quote. Whenever you're quoting in your speech, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, and I quote, end quote at the end of your quote. You can also paraphrase. Paraphrasing is better than direct quotation in two situations. When the wording of a quotation is obscure or cumbersome, or you need to put it in layman's terms, or when it's longer than 2 or 3 sentences. Audiences will often tune out partway through lengthy quotations, which tend to interrupt the flow of a speaker's ideas. So since the rest of the speech is in your own words, put longer quotations also in your own words. Things you can keep in mind for using testimony. Be sure to quote or paraphrase accurately. If you're going to quote, definitely write that down on your note card so you can get the quote right. You do not want to quote out of context or twist someone's remarks so as to prove anything. Think of the time when someone tricked you with a movie trailer and you found out that's not what the movie was about at all. That is essentially quoting out of context. Use information and testimony from qualified sources. Sources who are qualified to talk about what it is that you're referring to. Being a celebrity doesn't necessarily make someone an authority or a qualified source. Use testimony from unbiased sources. You might want to use testimony that doesn't come from self-interest or people who have something to gain from something. Also, always identify the people you quote or paraphrase. The usual way to identify your source is to name the person and sketch out their qualifications before presenting the testimony. So in their book, When Children Work, psychology professors Ellen Greenberger of the University of California and Lawrence Steinberg of Temple University note, and then I go ahead and give their paraphrase. Had the speaker not identified these two, listeners would not have had the foggiest idea who they were talking about or why we should bother. So identifying the sources of testimony is an important ethical responsibility for speakers. Now you might wonder, how do I do this in my speech? How do I cite sources orally? Name the document, the author sponsoring organization, the person's qualifications, and the date. So for example, the endangered monarch butterfly population can be seen most clearly in its shrinking migration. Michael Wines, science reporter for the New York Times, reported in the paper's January 29, 2014 issue that in only 1 year, the population of monarchs that migrates from Mexico for the winter shrank by 44%. Your textbook has a series of other samples for oral citations, for books, for newspapers, for magazines, for academic journals, for organizations or institutions, interviews, television programs, and websites. Take a look at them as you prepare your speech to make sure that you are citing, quoting, or paraphrasing appropriately.